Well, hi everyone. We're going to do things a little differently this time for a Facebook Live. I'm actually interviewing one of our scientists, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, and we're doing it over the internet. And I'm on a computer, and he's on a computer at home, and we're able to do this and to get it to you. And so, Dr. Jeanson actually has a PhD in biology from Harvard University, and he's one of the scientists at Answers in Genesis, and he does a lot of work on genetics, a lot of research on genetics. He's been doing a lot. In fact, he wrote the book Replacing Darwin, where he just absolutely devastates the idea that natural selection is a mechanism for evolution. But he's been doing a lot of genetics research on people groups around the world. And we've entitled this series, and we'll do one at 7 p.m. tonight, and then 7 p.m. Sunday night, and then we'll continue on with this series and see how we go on the weekends. So the title, A New History of the Human Race, the Resettling of the Americas Before Columbus and Other Surprises from DNA. So how about that? And I think he's going to blow people's minds with some of this stuff. For instance, he would say this: what does it mean to be of German descent? Is there such a thing as a German, a European? Do Egyptians exist, Chinese? And so it goes on. And in fact, I think he's going to talk about the fact that are British really French, or a French British, or that should stir up the world anyway. And who were the earliest people that settled the Americas? I mean, was it the American Indians? Was it not? He's got some fascinating information, because he's going to show you, he's going to look at people groups around the world differently than what you have heard from most places. So, Dr. Jeanson, welcome. And let me say one other thing just to qualify right from the start. When you use the terms black and white, we always say there's no truly black people, no truly white people, but we do it for the sake of talking about people's understanding of particular groups. We're all the same skin shade, but you're sort of talking about in regard to people groups and so on. So, Dr. Jeanson, tell us, give us some insight into what you're going to talk about in this series and share some exciting information with us.
Thank you. I am very excited to talk about this. I think our viewers will be too. Just a little bit of personal note. When my colleagues and I were working on this research, we got to a point where the results seemed so shocking we thought it couldn't possibly be true. But the more we dug into it, the more it started lining up with known history. And what we found is history, as you learn in the textbooks, tends to be a history of politics. Who was ruling where, who was the king when. But when you look at the history of peoples, which is what DNA records, there's a significant divergence, and so it rewrites who we came from and how we think about ourselves. So there's a lot in store. We'll take this in major sections. The first several episodes will deal with some of the background shocks that'll set you up for what's to come later, just because if I jumped right into the genetics, you wouldn't believe me, because it's that revolutionary. So the big question we're going to answer in each of these sessions is, who do we come from? Who are the ancestors? We know from Scripture, the 4 C's of the Old Testament, 7 C's of creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion. What we're going to focus on heavily is what happened after confusion. How do we go from Babel to the people groups we see today? What does it mean to be of European descent? What does it mean to be African? All of these sorts of things that we take for granted and have underlying assumptions. I've had underlying assumptions about, and a lot of the mysteries. For example, what happened to these ancient civilizations? The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. History books, at least when I took history, they present these kingdoms as rising, falling, as if they pop into existence out of nowhere and then disappear without a trace. But could they be in my family tree and your family tree? Are we related to the ancient pharaohs? I've also grown up with the assumption, I guess sort of a default, that the peoples of the lands that these civilizations were in today are the descendants. So if you talk to a Greek, presumably they're the descendants of the ancient Greeks. They can claim Aristotle. You talk to the modern Egyptians, surely they can claim the pharaohs. The modern Iranians can claim the Persians. Or to put it in the negative, I don't think any German would claim Greek heritage or Persian heritage or Egyptian heritage. And I've discovered that all those underlying stereotypes are wrong. And we'll discover this together. So just to give you a preview, we'll see that what I'm calling black, white people exist. Of course, there's no such thing as black and white. We're various shades of brown. But as the mainstream populace refers to black and white and divides people into races, we'll find that these racial designations hold some big surprises. And especially for people like white supremacists, they might be quite shocked to find out what their genetic heritage is. And hopefully that'll change some of their thinking. We're going to have a long time spent on what it means to be a European. And are there such things as indigenous Europeans? We'll see that many Europeans, probably the most Europeans, are of recent Asian descent, Central Asian, Middle Eastern descent. And if you look at genetics and you go back just a few hundred years, most European nationalities disappear. You don't see a long Greek lineage, a Roman lineage, a German lineage, these sorts of things. And of course, this touches on other aspects of history, things that I've wondered about for a long time. I grew up never being taught the pre-Columbian history of the Americas. When we're taught US history, it's basically Columbus, Pilgrims, and British colonies. But what happened before that? And I've gotten questions from Christians about, so where can we go to find the history of these people? Well, wherever you've gone before, it's about to get dramatically rewritten.
So, Dr. Jensen, most kids these days, and they go to public schools and so on, are taught it's aping your ancestry. So really, maybe we could title the series, Whose DNA is Really in Your Ancestry?
Exactly. And we'll hit some of the preview questions initially, just to set up the genetics. We'll then sort of work from the present day backwards in time and eventually get to those ancient history questions, which of course eventually touch on, what about the apes? Can you see Adam and Eve in your DNA? What about Noah and his family? Do they show up in genetics? Where's the echoes of biblical history? So we'll get to those as we go from the present day backwards in time. And the reason I do that is just because we're taking DNA, or I should say the DNA sequences that we have in our public databases are from primarily living people. And so you've got to start in the present and unravel the effects of recent history from the DNA history we can infer to go all the way back in time. Or to put it this way, I started this project trying to look for the history, the signature of Babel in our DNA, and I quickly recognized even the Bible talks about a whole lot of history after Babel. Just look at the history of Israel being conquered, being made captives and going back and forth to foreign lands. There's a lot of history that happens after Babel, and you have to unravel that first before you can go back to the ancient time points. And that brings us back, of course, to the question of the Neanderthals and who were they, and were they primitive, were they cavemen, were they advanced? What we'll find is that they were probably survivors of ancient catastrophes. And really, some of the clues we have to their nature, to their civilization, come from comparison to the Americas and how our stereotypes and views of the Native Americans have changed with time. And those same principles apply then back to the Neanderthals. But my overall goal, this is one of them, there's several though, there's apologetic elements in this, there's just pure curiosity elements of what happened in history. But ultimately though, it's the question of, who are you, who am I? And I've taken certain things for granted, you take certain things for granted, and my hope is you'll be able to marvel at your own story of how you got here, the stories of those you love, and really of all the people around the world, and marvel at these in a way you've never dreamed of marveling before. It's dramatically changed my own perspective on my own past. I hope it'll change yours. So today I want to make the point in a unique way that the world is a lot smaller than we think. This is not where I started this research, and I married my wife, shown here on the screen, just in 2013. When we were dating, 2012, I really gave no thought to how related we were. I was originally from Wisconsin. She originally she was born in Italy to missionary parents, but her family hails from Virginia, West Virginia, and she grew up in Alabama. So, hey, the world's a big place. What reason would I have to think that we're somehow closely related?
Now, obviously, we're all related because we go back to Adam and Eve, right?
Exactly.
But you're saying, really, we're all much more closely related than what we've been made out to believe.
Exactly. And my guess is most people would say, oh, my wife is my fourth cousin or third cousin. They'd start to feel a little bit uncomfortable. I've had some people be kind of proud of that fact, and I've scratched my head a little bit, but I think most folks would say, yes, I understand we go back to Babel, but that was such a long time ago. There's no reason for me to feel icky about how closely related my spouse and I are, or how closely related my parents are. And I've discovered that this is wrong. It's not because we've learned more about our family histories. So I'm half German. My dad has done a lot of work on my family tree. And on my mother's side, we've got last names like Meinke, Meyer, Bellmann, Prege, Kühne, good German names like that. On my dad's side, it's Nelson, Jensen, Heineck. And my wife's maiden name is Vaughn, V-A-U-G-H-A-N. And so on her side, Wood, Skaggs, Gross, Vaughn without the A. And she told me that there's no need to draw any assumptions about the relationship between the Vaughns without the A and the Vaughns with the A, but I'll leave it at that. So Scotch-Irish is what they'd say for that background. And again, I think most of us would say, okay, one side of the family hails from the UK area, one side from mainland Europe. Never the two shall mix, right? These countries have long and storied histories. There's no reason to give this a second thought. One of the ways, and one of the reasons I've been prompted to rethink this came about sort of indirectly. So the last time I took history was in high school, and I've learned that the history I learned, the world history I learned, was basically a history of Western civilization. And in a nutshell, it was essentially that civilization started somewhere in Mesopotamia. Now, I was homeschooled and went to a Christian high school, so we probably talked about Babel briefly in the flood, but then it kind of jumped right into Mesopotamia. Talk about Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. The shift tends to be on Europe then at that point. We talk about the Dark Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire, then the Renaissance, Reformation, and then the Age of Discovery, colonization, so forth, and there we are. That leaves a lot of the world's history out of the discussion, and so I've wondered what happened elsewhere in the world. And as I've had to look into this more because of my own research, I've discovered that the answers, even in history textbooks, leave much that's unsatisfying. So I'm just going to race through real fast a much broader view of world history. You might not be able to see the specific empires on the screen. What I want our viewers to see, though, is how much of the world is not covered, even in mainstream history texts. So we're going to just take a few snapshots here. 400 BC. In yellow here in the center of the screen, this is the Achaemenid or Persian Empire. You can think of biblical history there, Book of Daniel, and so forth. Northern Europe is mostly empty. There's beginning movements here in Greece. In just about 100 years, Alexander the Great's going to sweep through here and conquer much of the world. You can see in India there's some civilization. China is in the midst of dynastic change, but sub-Saharan Africa has very little to show here. Australia has very little to show. The Americas seem mostly empty, blank. It doesn't change much. If we go to the time of Christ then, 81, you'll recognize here in red the Roman Empire, in which the empire that was in existence when Christ came. You can see another empire here in the Middle East. Again, there's activity in India, China, but again, nothing in Africa to speak of, Australia, Central Asia, North America, South America. There's a little bit in Central America where modern day Mexico is, but not much to speak of. There's still a lot of the world that isn't, the story isn't told. 500 years later, again, same blanks largely appear. China's extended some of its domain. It's again going through dynastic succession. There's some activity here in Central Asia, Siberia, those empty. Again, the typical candidates for question marks are still there. Africa, Americas, Australia. 900 AD, same thing. The main blanks remain. Even in just 500 years ago, Columbus has discovered the New World, 1492. You're beginning to see some settlement in the Americas from Spain and Portugal, but most of modern day Russia is empty. Sub-Saharan Africa is still empty. Australia empty. On it goes, even up till 1700. America is mostly unsettled. Russian Empire is finally reaching east. You begin to see some activity in Africa. Transiently, even in 1815, just 200 years ago, we're looking at a world map that is largely empty. And I say empty in comparison to the modern map, in which basically every square inch of this planet has someone saying, mine. And I guess I've looked at the modern world map and assume it's been the same all throughout history, but it's not. It's right up just 200 years ago, much of the world is empty. And so I've grown up with this mystery, really, wondering what is the story of these other parts of the world? Whoops. I'm wondering how to keep my earphones in my ear while I'm talking too. First time, here we go. So these questions have remained outstanding, and I've learned part of the answer is lack of written records. So we know from archaeology that in Northern Europe, there's people there, they're doing things, but they didn't write down what they did. Whereas you get to the Roman Empire and such, some of the Greeks, they're writing histories, they're talking about what they did. So that's part of the reason for why there's so many blanks. But think about it. Here's the map in 400 BC. Are we to believe that there are people all around the globe, but 90% of them just choose not to write down? Are we still missing 90% of the history of the planet because people made decisions about whether or not they had time to discuss what their ancestors did? One of the shocks for me has been to view the map not in terms of political realms, but in terms of people. So here's another map of the world that shows you not political realms, but population density. And this is a recent map. This is 82,000, so just 20 years ago. And what strikes me rather starkly is how much of the world today is still largely empty. I don't get that impression looking at a political map. So you can see here, Australia is mostly unpopulated. North Africa, mostly unpopulated. Half of China. So China has 1 billion people. They're concentrated in half of what is the country of China. The other half of it is mostly empty. Siberia, Canada is mostly empty. The Western United States, Amazon. There's lots of the world. Middle East here you can see, Saudi Arabia, almost nobody there. If you think about it, and if you know the climates and geography of the world, it makes sense. So here's a map of global temperatures. Siberia, Canada are some of the coldest places on the planet. Purple, of course, is even colder, like Antarctica and Greenland, but blue, royal blue there, you can see is cold places. And so, not surprisingly, there are few people up in these very cold places, hard to have an existence there. And related to that is sort of the topography and climate of the planet. So you can see in China, the habitable regions are largely in the east. You go west, you're on the Tibetan Plateau, high altitude mountains. It's much harder to eke out an existence there. Of course, North Africa is mostly the Sahara Desert. Middle East is desert. Australia has the Great Outback, and Ken can tell you more about that. Western United States, mountains. Jungles, you might think, are a great place to live because of the climate, but if you want to increase your population size, you really need agriculture. And the jungles, for one, tend to have poor soils, and the other is there's a lot of land to clear if you want to start eking out an existence. So looking at the globe today, where people exist and where they're concentrated makes sense. They tend to be concentrated in those parts of the planet where the climate favors it. But it's not how I'm used to looking at the world. Mostly, or there's still significant chunks largely empty of people. So let's take this view of the world and then go back in time to 1000 BC. And we're gonna take 1,000-year leaps through history. So we'll do 1000 BC, 1 AD, 1000 AD, and then the present day, just to see how the concentration and distribution of peoples changes. So notice here in 1000 BC, and this is then based on partially historical records and archaeological digging and such. That's how these maps are reconstructed. Notice where people are concentrated. And what I want you to see is they're mostly concentrated in those places where history books make mention. India, China, Middle East, Europe. There's a little bit of activity here in the Americas, Central America, so the Olmec Civilization is going on. Some books will mention this. But the Americas are mostly empty of people. Sub-Saharan Africa, mostly empty of people. Up here, Central Asia, Siberia, empty. Australia, empty. And it doesn't change much, even 1,000 years later. You can see that it's become a little bit more intense in those regions of civilization. India, China, Middle East and Turkey, Europe, and so forth. We've got a little bit more here in the Americas. So this has now gone from the Olmecs to the Mayans. Their civilization is beginning. You've got some activity here on the Pacific coast of South America, but there's still big blank gray spots on this map. Even in 1000 AD, there's gigantic blank spots. You begin to see some more activity in Africa, particularly West Africa, which again is fairly arable land, a good land for agriculture, lots of people in Europe, Middle East, India, China. The Mayan civilization has just collapsed here by 1000 AD, but the peoples largely consist here. We're just 500 years removed from the height of the Aztec empires here and the Incan empires down here on the Pacific coast of South America. And then, of course, we're back to the modern era. And if you look at these maps carefully and you notice the changes in shade. So light yellow, of course, is a less dense population. Dark brown is intense population. It changes ever so slightly for the first 1,000 years and the second 1,000 years, and then it seems to take a big jump for the last 1,000 years. And that's not a quirk of the people who created this map. It's a reflection of the history of population growth. So the term hockey stick graph, of course, gets a controversial treatment when we're discussing climate change. It's actually an accurate description when we're discussing human population growth. And you can see right around 1500, 1400, there's a big bend in this curve upward. So to put it in math terms, for those who like math, in 1000 AD, the world population was around 50 million. It increases to only about 360 million in 1400 AD. So 2,400 years pass, and the world population doesn't even increase by a factor of 10. So 1400 is the end of the Black Death in Europe. It's happened a little bit earlier in East Asia. So the world population has gone down some. And then it just explodes in the last 600 years. So in the last 600 years, the world population has increased 20-fold, going from 360 million to nearly 8 billion today. That's a massive increase.
Dr. Jensen, if I could just jump in here for a minute too, I think it's good to point out to people that, hey, if man evolved millions of years ago, that curve should have gone up way before then.
It is a real puzzle. And the evolutionists say, and if you think about it and meditate about this, they say we had these small 10,000 people in Africa, not for 1,000 years, not for 2,000 years, but for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And you have to ask yourself, how did that small band of people survive? You think about all the wars, the crises, the famines, the plagues, the Black Death, and so forth that have struck the human population just in the last 2,500 years. How does the human population evolve and stay evolved and small for that length of time? It really does boggle the mind.
It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense.
But this makes sense when you think about coming from the Tower of Babel as the numbers increase, and then suddenly you get to a point where it just dramatically goes up.
Yeah. And the positive side of this then from a biblical perspective is people say, well, how can you go from 8 people to 8 billion? Really easily. It doesn't take much to go from the population size at the flood to even, let's say, 50 million, 1000 BC. I think it's population doubling or less. And you look at the list of the sons in Genesis 10, there's not population doubling, but some of those guys have 4 sons or more. It's rapid population growth. So it doesn't take much to go from 0 to 60, so to speak. What's interesting is why the human population didn't explode more recently. I think part of the explanation is modern medicine has prolonged lifespan. You don't have so much infant mortality. We've made advances in agriculture. We can feed more people. That's probably part of the explanation for why it's exploded so dramatically. Whatever the explanation is, we really do live at a unique time in history, and this has huge implications then, once we get to the genetics, we'll see, for how we understand it. It also has big implications without even getting into genetics. So here's a picture of me when my hair was taller and when I was single back in graduate school. Let's say I'm your average single guy in the modern era, and I'm looking for a spouse, and I do it the way many people do, and I go online and I enter my profile and looking for a spousal match, and they say, you've got 100 ladies that match what your interests are. This isn't actually 100. You have to flood the screen with faces to represent 100 matches. So let's say this is 82,000. I'm looking for a spouse. Well, the world population has increased 20-fold in the last 600 years. So if I was living in not 82,000, but 1400, and I was looking for a spouse, again, you don't have the internet, but hey, I need to find a spouse. Because the world population is 20-fold less, it's the equivalent of doing this and then having only 5 matches. And of course, the further back you go in time, the fewer and fewer people you get to pick from. So what does this have to do with who we come from and how we understand our ethnic identity? Well, we all come from somebody, but the history of world population growth, which is really the answer to my long-standing dilemma of why do history books cover what they do and what they don't, they cover where the people are, is really what it comes down to. And there weren't that many people in the world around. There were fewer somebodies to come from. So if you're a man in Europe looking for a wife in 1400, there aren't that many ladies to choose from. So either you're going to marry someone who's probably closer related to you than we might be comfortable with, or you're going to look outside your clan. And if you're looking outside your clan, that probably means the peoples of the world are much more closely related than we think. And I don't mean we're related to Babel. That's all true. I'm saying even more recently than that, in ways we may not be comfortable with. So there's a good chance you go back a few hundred years and me and my wife find a common ancestor that might make us 25th cousins, which, okay, maybe that doesn't make many people uncomfortable, but I'm going to guess most of us don't stop and think how closely related we are in the family tree. And even just to put a number on it, it's like, oh, hey, spouse, I view you now in a different way. So the world really is smaller than we think. This large planet which we live is an artifact of the recent spike in population growth. And we'll see this played out over and over again in genetics. So who do we come from? How could all these people be related? We'll find out they're going to be a lot more related than we think, because the world is a whole lot smaller than we think. And because the ancients had far fewer people to choose from when it came to spouses, there's relationships among them that are much closer than we think and eventually connect to us. So the world is smaller than we think, and we're going to see this played out in a big way as we get into the genetics eventually.
Well, this is going to be absolutely fascinating to look at this, because really you're sort of rewriting history that most people have heard at school, rewriting it, and based on genetics. And then when you look at scripture, you see that, wow, the history in the Bible then makes sense of the genetics that you see. And that's what you're going to talk about in other programs.
We'll see that the biblical history makes sense. We'll talk about how the evolutionary history does not. We'll talk about the implications for ethnic identity, how we view each other. There's huge implications for racial identity, racism, how we treat other people, for what the term foreign actually means. There's all sorts of mind-bending things we're going to get into.
And so, as you said earlier, for those people who call themselves white supremacists, they might be shocked to find in their ancestry people who you would call black or with dark skin.
Exactly.
And you're going to find that for the French and the British, who, I don't know, there's rivalry there, I guess, like New Zealanders and Australians, right? But for the French and the British, they're going to find they're more closely related than they really think they are.
The term brothers takes on a whole new meaning when you start digging into these questions.
Well, there we are. This is going to be fascinating. Well, Dr. Jeanson, this is only part one. Like, you're probably going to go for millions of years.
Exactly.
But we don't have millions of years of human history. So, but we will conclude part one, and then we will have part two again the next night, Sunday night at 7 p.m. And what are you going to, just give us a quick summary, what you'll be doing there in part two?
I'm calling the next session Why the French Are Probably British and Vice Versa. We're going to take a deep dive into family trees, but without even needing to look at a single DNA sequence. There's a little bit of math involved that's not intimidating at all, and it's really shocking if you just stop and think about it for a little while, and has immediate practical implications for some of these, what we thought were separate long-standing relationships.
That is going to be fascinating. Okay, so come back for part two, 7 p.m. Sunday, March, I'm trying to think what the date should be, March 23, because it's March 21 today, I think. Am I right there? This is Friday the 20th. So 21, this is the 21st, this is showing. And so the 22nd, Sunday the 22nd of March. And of course, we'll have these archived anyway. But this will be a little bit of history here, recording our human history and populations during the coronavirus situation. So there we are. All right, come back for part two, 7 p.m. Sunday night.